Hello, and welcome to this edition of the Archaeological Science interview series sponsored by the Society for Archaeological Sciences. My name is AJ White, and I'll be hosting today's interview. I'm a grad student at UC Berkeley and an SAS student ambassador. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Marcos Martinón-Torres, the Pitt Rivers Professor of Archaeological Science at the University of Cambridge and recent SAS president. Dr. Martinón-Torres, thank you very much for being here today.
Hello, AJ, and thank you for having me.
Wonderful. So I wanted to start our conversation with theory of all things, and here's why. So I have this notion in my head that archaeological scientists don't really talk about theory, and yet you've written several publications about archaeological theory, well, very much being an archaeological scientist, in practice. So in as much detail as you want to get into, how are theory and science related in archaeology? And what can we do better to unite these two subjects?
Very good question, though you may regret saying in as much detail as you wish, because you could have me here forever. This is one of my pet topics. Of course, there is a lot, not just by me, but discussed and written about archaeology or archaeological theory on the one hand and science on the other hand, and how best to integrate them, etc. And yeah, I have, I suppose, increasingly strong views about this conversation. Maybe if we start with the simplest definition of what theory is, that may give us a starting point. So theory, we could say, is a form of abstract thinking, typically rational, about a particular phenomenon, be it human behavior or the movement of planets in the skies. And usually this abstract thinking is based on some kind of observational study, what we call research. And so from this definition, I think that the first thing that comes immediately apparent is that all of us doing research work within some theoretical framework. And so that idea that scientists lack theory is, I think, overly simplistic. We're not just ignorant. We all have theories, and those theories in a laboratory environment are the ones that give us the basic concepts or models or predictions, indeed, as to what's going to happen in our experiments. We all operate, as I said, within these theoretical paradigms. And the challenge, therefore, in my view, is to find overlaps in those epistemologies, in those concepts, in those interests and questions and priorities. So it's not that some of us have theories and others don't. It's just that we may operate in different spheres. And what we need to find is that common areas of interest and overlap, I believe. And we need to do that, of course, with mutual respect and mutual interest in what the others have to offer. So having said this, some people are, of course, happier and more comfortable because of their background or skills. Some are more comfortable describing the observational data, generating the data, or analyzing the data, in whichever field. And others may be more comfortable developing this abstract thinking, engaging with the theory more explicitly. But I see these two as ends of one spectrum, and they are all needed, as opposed to either or. So that's the first thing. The other one is that within these two ends of the spectrum, it's not as if at one end we have the archaeologists, who are the high theoreticians, and the other end we have the scientists who produce data and have no ability to theorize or no interest in theory. I think that this is overly simplified. In debates about archaeological theory and archaeological science, we often refer to the two cultures debate that you may have heard of, which, as you know, started in the 1950s after a very famous lecture by C.P. Snow, where he was saying basically that in the same way as we expect everyone to know about Shakespeare, we should expect everyone to know about the second law of thermodynamics, because that's general culture too, which I think is a valid point, but it has been polarized as a debate. It has led some people to say, well, what happens is that those who work within the framework of the humanities and those who work in the sciences are in such different worlds. They are interested in such different things. They think in such different ways that there's no way of reconciling them. And I don't think that's true anymore at all, if it ever was. It may have been applicable to the science in British academia 70 years ago, if it was back then. But nowadays, I don't think that's the case. So we have different areas of intersection between scientists and archaeologists and the everything in between that many of us try to embody as far as we can. And some people may find it easier with theoreticians or scientists of certain persuasions. So if you work, say, with materials and technologies, as I do, often you will find that theories in social anthropology of material culture are those that you're more prone to engaging with. Whereas people who work maybe in biological anthropology or bioarchaeology will find it easier to engage with evolutionary theory developed in biology. And this is not to say that there cannot be other forms of less predictable overlap. That's the richness of our discipline. But ultimately, what nags me, I suppose, increasingly is that there are many examples of bad practice, and we do well to call them out. And there are cases of scientific analysis that shouldn't have happened because they had no particular question, or because they are reinventing the wheel because they were somewhat perhaps arrogant or in their approach, thinking that there's no need to engage with the pre-existing body and questions and theory and even the ethics of archaeological research. And you think you arrive as a scientist and you can provide answers that are more objective and better. Of course, that shouldn't have happened. Equally, we can criticize those archaeologists who decided that science is not for them, and I don't believe in science because this is an intromission and they don't understand our concerns, etc. I think largely, I was going to say the days of that are past, and maybe that's overly optimistic of me. But what I would say is that there are plenty of examples of good practice. We're all familiar in our respective fields of projects where theory, science, archaeology are seamlessly integrated, projects that are saying interesting things about the past, but that are also contributing to scientific advances, to discussions that are relevant in the current world. And I think that more and more we should be celebrating those, enshrining those in some ways, giving those the prominence they deserve, instead of focusing so much on the bad practice. There's bad practice in every field. Of course, even without bringing the science, within archaeology alone, there are archaeological sites being excavated that you would question whether they should be excavated, because excavation is destruction. There's no particular question. They are not properly published and recorded. Equally, I'm sure there are plenty of scientific experiments that are not well justified. But let's capitalize on the good ones, because now we do have good examples of archaeological science well integrated with theory, individuals who move across those increasingly dilute boundaries. So let's ride on those rather than keeping complaining about perhaps the examples that we can all cherry pick that are not so good. And again, perhaps being overly optimistic, I think if we look at the long term, eventually, and because archaeology and archaeological science are increasingly mature, we have a history that allows us to look at the past of our engagement with the sciences. And I think whenever a new technology appears in archaeology or elsewhere, and this is something I've written about, we can clearly see the Gantt cycle of the Gantt cycle of technologies, as it has been called. We have an initial over-enthusiasm, the peak of inflated expectations, when we think this new technique is going to solve all of the problems. And against that, very soon, there is a backlash, typically by well-informed archaeologists who say, this is not like that. You're oversimplifying things. You're not aware of sampling biases. You're disregarding this body of evidence that every archaeologist knows about. You're not considering the political implications of the stupid things you're saying. And after this interesting criticism and dialogue, sometimes can be quite vocal, we reach that plateau of enlightenment where we begin to have a more fertile, more balanced, etc., well-grounded use of that technology. And so I believe that will always end up happening. I mean, that happened, of course, with the radiocarbon revolution, C14, fantastic. Oh, no, it doesn't work. We need to calibrate. Oh, we calibrate it. It works very well. And then we get some people who say, no, I don't believe in radiocarbon. I will never look back. Well, you're lost. You're the one missing out. That happened with, lead isotope analysis, who were initially, again, there was a backlash, rightly so, but now they are used a lot more critically. And if you think of ancient DNA now, which is one of the more prominent areas within archaeological science, there is still quite a lot of criticism from well-established archaeologists saying things are not being done right. And I think they are right to say that, but also we have good examples of good use of DNA integrated within archaeological projects. Things will, I hope, continue to get better, also in terms of the ethics and politics of doing ancient DNA, and eventually we'll reach the plateau and we'll move on to the next new technology. I'm sure these conversations were being had about, I don't know, spatial analysis or even stratigraphy decades. They become part of the toolkit of archaeology, and we move on, and no longer we have a problem. And I warned you that you told me to go in as much detail as I wanted, and here you have me going on forever. Sorry.
No, I'm glad you did. And I got to say, it's refreshing to, speak as two archaeological scientists about theory. I think I kind of shied away from it as a grad student. It's one of those first courses that you take. But as I kind of circle back to seeing the importance of integrating, scientific techniques, but, high-minded archaeological theory and questions, I really get your point. So I think it's good to talk about. And I wonder if my trajectory would have been different if I had this conversation from day one of grad school.
I think it's a very good point you make about how you're being taught and how we mostly were being taught. And we were taught those things as separate matters. We have a module on archaeological theory, one on laboratory skills, and many others, and limited attempts at crossing those. And those, of course, are not the best ways of teaching interdisciplinarily. And now there are more and more courses that focus on themes, on questions, bringing together all the theoretical and methodological tools that are relevant to them. Think, of course, I don't know, the archaeology of food. And so those can integrate theory, anthropology, heritage studies, etc. And those may be more prone to facilitate those integrations.
Yeah. You started speaking about food and made me think it's not like you have to choose a cookie or a cake. Like you can have both, and that's the best approach. Okay, so I'd like to move on now to the, what I am tempted to say the other side, but it's not, as we just talked about, which is more of the analytical end of things and in your work there. So you've worked on archaeometallurgy projects, that span thousands of years and have occurred on multiple continents. Of these studies, which have you found most methodologically challenging, such as needing to invent a new technique to solve a problem? And then do you have a project that you could pick as the one you've enjoyed the most?
That's a difficult question because, of course, I have been very lucky to being involved in loads of projects in various regions, etc. And with every project comes its challenge, as well as with every challenge its opportunity and its reward. You have to think specifically of something that was challenging methodologically. Perhaps I would highlight one strand of a project in China. In China, for many years, we've been working with the Terracotta Army of the first emperor, and generally trying to understand the logistics of how that mausoleum was put together in a particular political context, etc. But one of the many challenges we had there, one of the side questions, had to do with the bronze weapons, thousands of them that were buried with the Terracotta Army. The question of why they were so well preserved. How was it that 2,000 years on, they were largely still shiny and sharp and not corroded? And whether, as had been suggested before, this was the result of some arcane, ancient anti-rust technology. So in trying to address that question, we had to do a lot of analysis of those weapons themselves, particularly the fact that some of them or their parts appear to have chromium traces on the surface, which might suggest they had been treated with chromium or chromium oxide to prevent corrosion. What was particularly challenging was, well, two things. One, that all of our analysis, or the vast majority of them, had to be conducted non-invasively and in China to, of course, minimize our impact on heritage, as well as to avoid having to move artifacts back and forth. But the other one, which was even more critically, was that in order to address this question, we had to engage not just the study of the metal weapons, but also the study of the soils where they had been buried, of the pigments that appeared associated to the warriors, but to many other artifacts, because there are potentially dozens of different contaminants of different compositions. We had to look at the lacquer, which was eventually the source of chromium. So the chromium had been post-depositionally migrated from lacquer that was used for coating warriors and other items into our metal. And it was the combination of all of these different items of material culture, the lacquer, the ceramics, the pigments, the metals, the wood, that we had to study together to understand what had happened. Basically, the main reason for the preservation of the weapons was simply the geochemical environment, the nature of the soil, and the lacquer the chromium had migrated from the lacquer into the weapons. Now, this required basically integration, not of archaeological science and archaeological theory, but integration of different areas of archaeological science that often are separate. And that's where we do need still more to do for integration, our different niches of specialization. So that was quite challenging, but also quite satisfying when eventually we arrived at an answer that we broadly all agreed on. In other places, the challenge has often been generally the lack of facilities in situ. And so we've had to be early adopters of portable technologies to work in China, in Africa, in South America. And that has been challenging, but it also has been fantastic because it has meant that by bringing the technology to the museum or to the archaeological site, we have been able to engage much more directly with developing local capacity, discussing the uses and limitations of the techniques we bring with us, and generally, again, integrating and breaking barriers between the users of science and the consumers of science or those sorts of things. So it's been challenging, but also rewarding. And it's something we are seeing, I think, across the board, that again, we are diluting the borders between the lab and the field and the museum. And I think that can only be a good thing.
Absolutely. The idea of this mobile laboratory concept, I think that really gets rid of the kind of gatekeeping that goes on with saying, okay, the laboratory is in London or New York and, very specific places, but by bringing it, anywhere, that really erodes a lot of these kind of hierarchies that I think have existed historically in archaeology. That's amazing. And also, I'm amazed. I can't imagine the pressure you would feel dealing with the Terracotta Army artifacts and just, I deal with dirt. So, on the various scales of, sweat going down one's brow when they're looking at the artifacts. I respect that a lot. So I'd like to take another kind of turn in our conversation here to talk kind of about your progress in your career as an archaeologist. And I'd like to highlight that you're editor-in-chief of the Journal of Archaeological Science. A question that I have that I just simply don't know the answer to is, how does one become an editor at a journal? And then do you have any advice for emerging archaeological scientists more broadly on how to expand their professional activities?
I'm glad you asked me that question, because it's one I get asked quite frequently, and so I'll be able to now refer to this interview. You get to become an editor generally by contributing to that journal, initially as a reviewer, so getting progressively engaged with that journal as a reviewer who is willing to help where possible within their expertise, or when not advising on other potential reviewers. And then that's what leads to potentially being invited to become an associate editor at some point, and so on. I mean, that's certainly what happened to me, and that's how we often now look at prospective associate editors. We look at in our pool of reviewers for people with relevant expertise who have engaged with us before. It's not the only way, but it's the most common. Now, these may not solve your problem, because, of course, you need to get invited to review those papers to start with. And the answer to that is, we editors, we need to know you exist, and we would love to know you exist, so that we can avoid, and we desperately try, avoid going always to the usual suspects. Going to the usual suspects, to the purported leaders of the discipline means that we create a very close circle. We create a very strong conformist bias of what we always like and reproduces itself. But also, you engage with people who are too busy or too tired or can't be bothered. So we're very keen to diversify and generally expand our pool of reviewers. For that, we need you to sign up to our reviewers list. You can sign up on your favorite journal as a reviewer. So input your details with your keywords so that when I am looking for somebody to review a paper on strontium isotopes, I can actually search strontium isotopes and see who comes up. And often somebody appears too reasonably junior, and we'll make sure we pair them with somebody more senior, and they will cover different things. So it's not a problem being junior. It's not a problem emailing an editor saying, look, I thought I would introduce myself. I'm this person, and I'm interested in reviewing, I'm available for reviewing papers on such and such subject. You can also tell your supervisors and mentors, who will often receive those invitations, to reply to the editors either saying, yes, but why don't you also invite that person? Or no, I'm too busy, but you could also invite this person who has relevant expertise. So yeah, you can be proactive in some ways, but you can also mention this to your own supervisors and mentors, who can be very useful. And often that does happen, that a colleague of mine will tell me, I have these new postdoc coming from somewhere else who's doing really good work on this and this, and maybe you want to use them to review papers in this field. And as I said, it works for all of us, because we are very keen to hear about people who may not have the breadth of expertise of more senior folk, but they may know a lot about specific subjects and be ideally suited to review on those topics. And it is, in addition to, of course, helping you with your CVs, it is good to feel you're doing something for the broader community. It allows you, of course, to see research as it happens, even before it's published. It's very educational, especially as now many journals, including ours, share all the reviews with all the reviewers. So you see what you wrote about the paper, but also what other reviewers wrote about the paper. So you can see what you may have missed or where you may disagree. So yeah, I strongly encourage you to do all of that. And that works better than approaching an editor directly and saying, I would like to be a member of your editorial board, which does happen too. But it's a more direct, but in practice less effective route, I think.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that. There's this information about professional development that sometimes I feel like you just have to ask someone who is in that position. And so thank you for getting that out. I think this will be useful information, if not for everyone else, at least for me. So yeah, I'll need to start writing some emails, I think. So thank you for that advice. I'd like to have one more question here, and that is because this interview is sponsored by SAS. So I'm wondering if you could, share about the position that you've had in the society and how you became involved with SAS in the first place.
So I became a member of the executive board 5 or 6 years ago. Of course, I was well familiar with the SAS, but it was at that point when the then President Rachel Popelka-Filkov encouraged me to throw my hat in the ring for the next election for president. Then membership had the generous idea of voting me for that role. And since then, I have been quite actively involved with the executive board for 2 years as president-elect, kind of bringing myself up to speed, then 2 years as president, and now winding down or handing it over to more competent people as the past president, but still involved. And what I have found there really is a community of people who are genuinely generous with their time and with their ideas. And that's something that I find humbling and admirable. People like you, AJ, and plenty of others who do these for the sake of creating a stronger community and genuinely believing that there is something to be gained through collective action, supporting each other as a peer group. Rightly placing the emphasis on early career scholars, sharing on the one hand from a more academic perspective the standards of good practice, etc., but also at a more personal level, understanding the struggles and the uncertainties and the sorts of questions that you're asking me earlier, and that are relevant to many, and therefore you want to share that knowledge for what it's worth. And I think it is the best form of a union, if you like, internationally, and increasingly so, increasingly global and diversified, of not just early career researchers, but also senior scholars. And all I can say is, based on my experience, encourage everyone to become a member, because the more of us join the SAS, the more representative it will be, and the more it will help serve our needs. I think if you're an early career scholar, it's a no-brainer, because it's a very good value for money, and 80%, if not more, of all of the initiatives, awards, workshops, seminars, community support are geared toward you. So you should join it. But the more senior folk, I think, should also join SAS, and many do, because it's a way to keep you abreast of what the newest and who are the up and coming next generation of archaeological scientists, but also because I think we owe it to the field and we need to give something back. We've done well out of archaeological science, so I think it's only fair we pay it forward and do something for the broader community. And so I think there's something for all of us there. And my experience has been extremely good, and I hope it continues to be so for many others.
Well, thank you for sharing your experience. I mean, I really appreciate all of the information that you provided here today. Again, a lot of this is stuff that you can't easily read in a paper. And so I really appreciate you taking the time to share your experiences today. So Dr. Martinón-Torres, thanks once again for being on this interview.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
All right. Finally, thanks to everyone for watching, and please subscribe to the SAS YouTube page for more resources about archaeological science. Thank you.